Well, welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle show. I am super stoked because it's time for another mind-blowing episode with Dr. Ray Peat. Dr. Peat and I decided to do listener questions today, so I can hardly wait to hear his responses to some really great questions that people put up on the posts and on my Facebook and things like that. So I appreciate you guys asking questions. And Dr. Peat, I appreciate you because once again, I'm so honored beyond words to have you with me. Thank you so much. So are you ready for this slew of questions?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Great. Well, we'll start with this person wanted to remain anonymous, but they said, and it was kind of an interesting question. They said, can you give us your opinion on the current fitness trends and also what your daily exercise looks like? So this one's a little personal to you, Dr. Peat.
I never exercise. Well, once about every 10 years, I do some exercises just to see how things are working.
Okay.
But the idea of exercise, I think, is not biologically sound.
Okay.
I think all of your activities should be intentional, in some way constructive, or at least pleasure-giving. And the idea of exercise seems to be more fulfilling a duty or obligation rather than doing something just because it's fun or productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that kind of takes me down. I'm going to go a little further down on my list because there was another person that asked a similar question about exercise, and this was an individual who likes to run. And this woman said, if a woman would like to run on a regular basis for enjoyment, is that something that's beneficial, and does she need to be more vigilant as far as PUFA intake and environmental estrogens?
If you have a very pretty place to run in, like the natives of northern Mexico have canyons and interesting scenery to run through, just to do their social visits and tend to their chores and such. So running is part of their lives, but it's also meaningful in many ways. It isn't just running down the street to a certain point and coming back. The roteness of it, the predictability and sameness of it, I think is actually somewhat harmful to your nervous system.
Yeah, so what you're saying is more, you're thinking in terms of movement, like people need to move their bodies, but not necessarily, getting on a treadmill or an elliptical machine to hash out 45 minutes just because they feel like they should.
Yeah, the brain, the mind has to move at least as much as the body. And when you're on a treadmill or running down a certain track, your mind is not moving. Your body is moving, but your mind is in a rut. And being in a rut is biologically harmful.
From a stress standpoint, right? So sometimes these exercises that we're trying to do to get our bodies in shape, if we don't enjoy them, they can actually be stress-inducing, yes?
Yep. And deepening the rut, a habit of doing something that isn't pleasurable or meaningful, deepens your tolerance for meaningless-ness, and you're at risk of sinking into routine behavior and routine life.
Yeah, I like that. I like not living a life, like you said, not a meaningless existence or having meaningless in your life. We need to have meaning in everything we do. So I like that approach. The next question is, Dr. Peat, could you please tell us the difference between a dairy allergy and lactose intolerance? Like, what different symptoms would we expect between the two? And what can we also do in case it's actually a dairy allergy? So I guess in terms of them saying if it is a dairy allergy versus the intolerance, what can we do? And I'm sure you have some insight on this as to what they can do to kind of make the intolerance go away, because I've heard you talk about that.
An allergy can be deadly. Mm-hmm. A mild allergy is just annoying. It makes, if it's on your tongue or mouth, it makes it burn and maybe swell up a little. If it's serious, it will make your membranes swell up just to a hideous extent, so that you can't move your tongue, can't swallow, and in any of the surfaces that it reaches, if it's a real allergy, it can stop the function, can make it impossible to breathe, for example, which is fatal. But lactose intolerance is simply the inability to absorb and digest milk sugar. And if you have a sugar in your intestine that can't be absorbed, it has a laxative effect, and it tends to run through you. Or if you have the wrong kind of bacteria, the bacteria can convert it to gas. And so gas is the most common symptom for lactose intolerance.
And so, like I've heard you mention before, if somebody does have an intolerance, I've heard you talk about how different approaches towards nutrition can actually help that individual develop a tolerance and be able to eat dairy, yes?
A deficiency of thyroid hormone creates various inefficiencies metabolically. Low production of digestive enzymes is typical. Low stomach acid sometimes, and the enzymes to digest lactose, among other things, will be low when your thyroid hormone activity is low. And so low thyroid people, as a rule, to some extent have a lactose intolerance, and just fixing the thyroid function will improve their digestion of milk. There were studies of people who were theoretically, genetically unable to digest lactose because of their race, and tests done in those people, starting with half a glass of milk or a quarter of a glass of milk every day. Doing that for a few weeks, they found that these genetically intolerant people were able to induce the enzyme. The enzyme is there in infancy, and it's just a matter of keeping it active or reinducing it as an adult by giving your intestine the exposure to a daily amount of lactose.
Okay, that's interesting. So I'm going to throw in my own question here. So let's say somebody, like you said, we have that since infancy, has the ability to digest dairy, but like all of a sudden in their older years, they can't digest it anymore. Like what would be the cause of that? Would that have to do with the low thyroid and like you were mentioning, the low stomach acid?
Or a vitamin deficiency.
Oh, okay.
And vitamin deficiencies and thyroid deficiencies often go together. Mm-hmm. As your digestive system slows down from low thyroid, you will absorb poorly and be more likely to get a vitamin deficiency.
Okay, well then hopefully that's helpful to that listener that they can start to maybe take some thyroid and be able to replenish their ability to take in dairy, because that actually happened to me. Once I got my thyroid working after that toxic mold exposure, I was able to do dairy again, which before I'd been having problems with it. So yeah, I think you're obviously spot on. So okay, go ahead.
I've known people who recovered from a variety of very different kinds of allergies or sensitivities. Aspirin sensitivity is another thing that is supposed to be genetic. But I have a friend who was, for 55 years of his life, he was thought to be aspirin intolerant, and now he takes aspirin every day.
Wow, that's fantastic. Okay, so there is hope for those people that have intolerances to certain things. The next question we got was, what is the root cause of grinding of the teeth? Or I guess it's called bruxism, is that right?
Yeah, and serotonin excess is one of the things that happens during the night. And usually an irritation in the intestine during the night. As your blood sugar goes down, your nerves and immune system become more irritable because of the falling energy supply. And that irritability during the night, even though the food wasn't causing an allergic reaction during the daytime, during the night, the falling blood sugar makes you start sensing relatively toxic things in your intestine or irritating things, and that causes the intestine to increase its production of serotonin, and serotonin is closely connected with bruxism.
Oh, that's really interesting. So someone would want to get their serotonin levels down in order to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, usually just looking at your diet and finding things that are not well digested. Green salads are the worst offenders. That they never can be digested by a human being, and so they feed whatever bacteria or fungus happens to be in your system, and then the fungus or bacteria will make toxins that irritate the intestine so that it overproduces things such as histamine, serotonin, and nitric oxide.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people women especially will say, well, I have a green salad every day, and yet I have a lot of digestive issues. And, we want to tell them, well, that, here's your sign. That's why it's happening, is like you said, we can't digest all of those greens.
Yeah, we simply don't have enzymes to digest them. There were experiments with rats, feeding them fresh, raw vegetables, or the same vegetables that had been canned at very high temperature and pressure. And supposedly the nutrients are lost by high temperature cooking, but actually because it breaks down the cellulose, it actually makes more nutrients available, so that the rats wasted away when they were fed fresh vegetables, but thrived on the canned vegetables of exactly the same sort. And you can do an experiment if you put a bit of green salad into a plastic bag and then keep it at body temperature for 2 or 3 days, which would happen after you ate it. See what happens to the fresh green salad after 2 or 3 days at body temperature. Usually a foul mess.
I can imagine that would be a fun party trick to show your friends. Like, look what's happening to salads when we eat them. Okay, so Rachel asks the next question. She says, what does Dr. Peat feel are the better exercises, of course we touched on that, foods, supplements for middle-aged women in regards to lowering chronic stress or cortisol? I know getting outdoors in nature and plenty of sunshine are huge lifestyle factors in helping this, but what else? And as always, thank you.
If you live in a woodsy, cold climate, cutting wood and stacking it in the summer months is a good, useful exercise that uses your muscles. And in the winter, or if you don't have wood to cut, dumbbells are the closest thing to getting muscle use.
Oh, I love that you just said that, because I went camping recently and my husband and my brother were showing me how to chop wood and for the fire, and I fell in love with it. Like, I told them I want to learn how to be a really great wood chopper, and it was such a great workout, and yet it was fun too, and it was almost like a stress reliever too.
And with a good crosscut saw, you can saw logs for the fireplace and get push and pull exercise on your arm muscles, using alternate arms on a crosscut saw. It's like a very expensive exercise machine.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to give that a try too, because I was just using an axe and chopping. So I got the chopping mechanism, but I didn't do the push-pull. Now, she also asked, what supplements or nutrition do you recommend as far as lowering chronic stress and cortisol?
Things that are easy to digest and that don't lower your blood sugar are the most powerful anti-stressors. Calcium, keeping the ratio of calcium to phosphate very high in your diet has a relaxing anti-stress effect. When your muscles are active and growing, they actually produce some testosterone. When they're under stress and not being used properly, they tend to convert cholesterol into cortisol and actually create the stress syndrome. The unused muscle is slightly toxic under some conditions, where the used muscle is adding to your steroid protective hormones.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to throw in a question here too. Since you have a lot of history in Mexico, living down there and such, I have kind of a favorite starchy vegetable that's jicama, and I was wondering your thoughts on jicama as far as a food that's might be good for digestion or not, or what do you think about jicama in general?
I've eaten a lot of it, and I don't generally tolerate starches well. For example, cucumbers give me terrible gas, and even cantaloupes are too gas forming for me. But I never had trouble with jicama. I don't know what it is, but it is a starch, but it isn't famously gas producing.
Yeah, I noticed that for myself, that I found it easy to digest, but there are so many other raw vegetables that if I would try to eat them in, the raw state, then I would have problems, but not that one. So I wonder if it's because it may be part of the tuber family, like a potato.
It's in a very different family, but it's probably a different set of allergens and antigens.
Okay, well, good to know. I've been wanting to ask you that for a while, so that's good. Okay, and then Tina asks, does Dr. Peat advise those coming from calorie-restricted eating and intermittent fasting protocols to slowly increase food intake and possibly count calories? So that's her first question. So what do you think about somebody coming from calorie-restricted and intermittent fasting, and how would they slowly increase their food intake and count calories, or should they?
The important thing is to watch your temperature and pulse rate as indicators of how energetic your metabolism is. It's normal for your metabolic rate to go down during the night, but after breakfast, you should pop right up to a working temperature of 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit, and the pulse rate of more or less 80 or 85 beats per minute, I think is good during the day.
Great. And also, her second part of her question was, should we take T4 with T3, or does Dr. Peat advise just taking T3?
The value of T3 in a free form is that if you're in a hurry to correct a problem, you can use a physiological replacement amount of T3, such as between 1 and 4 micrograms per hour. And like with a meal where you're going to be absorbing food for 2 or 3 hours, 10 micrograms with a meal is a pretty physiological amount. And you can see if that relieves your symptoms. I've seen very serious symptoms disappear in as little as a minute after taking a 5 or 10 microgram dose of T3. Insomnia will very often disappear 5 minutes after chewing up a bit of T3. You don't have the usual delay in getting to sleep, and pains, arthritic pains or breast pains, for example, will disappear from 5 to 15 minutes after taking some. So it's valuable for its essentially instantaneous repair functions, but it goes away almost as fast as it takes effect. And I, for a time, was taking 25 micrograms in the morning all at once. And after doing that for a couple of weeks, at sunset, my heart would begin stopping every 10 seconds for 2 or 3 seconds at a time. And once it stopped so long that I started blacking out with a shrinking visual field, and had to cough repeatedly to get my heart started again. So I realized that taking an outsized dose all at once, after a week or two, your liver starts eliminating the T3 at an exaggerated rate, because it doesn't recognize that as a natural process. And after 12 hours of the liver excreting it at that high rate, if you don't replace it, suddenly you've gone to an extremely hypothyroid state, which leads to heart arrhythmia as the worst symptom. And if you take the T4 only, a very healthy person, they tested it in the 1940s on male medical students and said thyroxine T4 only had exactly the same effect that the full thyroid substance had on these healthy young men. But they didn't test it on women, and it happens that estrogen affects the liver and the thyroid gland, blocking secretion of the hormone from the gland and slowing the metabolic process of the liver. So it turns out that women have about 5 as a replacement only for healthy people. But the people who have a metabolic problem, mostly women, it's exactly the wrong thing to use. But since you don't want to have to take 4 micrograms of T3 half a dozen times a day, if you take T4 in the evening, for example, once a day, a dose of T4 will help to sustain things through the night, but it should be accompanied by ideally 1 or 2 doses of T3 during the daytime. The sustaining effect of T3 during the night means that when you're exposed to the T3, it should activate your liver, keep the estrogen from accumulating. The liver excretes excess estrogen, and the active liver will activate the thyroid gland, protecting it from the blocking effect of estrogen. Given the supporting effect of T3, then a woman's liver can metabolize T4 just like a man's.
Wow. Okay, that was something that I had been interested in learning about too, because I have seen people take T3 and then they say that after a couple weeks they no longer can notice the difference on it. Would that be because the liver is starting to push some of it out since they're taking it, and now they need to up their dose, or should they just?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you take 5 or 10 or 20 micrograms at once, your liver is going to develop super excretory enzymes to lower it faster than normal.
Okay, and then taking T3 sounds like a way to remove excess estrogens from the body. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that will help you handle the T4.
Okay. Well, speaking of excess estrogen, there was another listener, Diego. He had a question about anti-aromatase products such as Exemestane. So he said, what do you think of anti-aromatase products like Exemestane, also known as aramasin? Those
generally have fairly serious side effects.
Okay.
The one of them, which is a steroid, I forget whether that's the one you named.
Mm-hmm.
The steroid-based one is the least toxic of the aromatase inhibitors.
Okay. So probably needs to be careful with that then if there are some pretty harsh side effects, yeah?
And there are safe aromatase inhibitors, aspirin and progesterone, for example, do a very good job.
Yeah, that's a much better point. Much safer to take those things for sure. Okay, we have a gal named Christy that had a couple questions. The first question is, I'm losing weight and my hands and feet are cold even with natural thyroid medication, and I'm getting colder, so why is that?
It's important to check temperature and pulse rate, as well as how you're feeling. If you have been reducing your intake of nutrients, you might have reduced some essential nutrient so much that you're in a stress state, and high cortisol can make you lose weight under stress, but it will be primarily muscle weight. Dieters used to go on a very low-calorie diet or even fast, and find that they could lose 10 or 12 pounds in a week or 10 days. Someone did a study analyzing what was happening to the body, and they found that on an extremely low-calorie diet, the weight loss was about 80% protein and only something like 15 or 20% fat. But if they took a moderate amount of nutrition, enough to reduce the stress hormones, they could lose 80% fat and only 15 or 20% protein tissue. So it's essential to keep your adequate nutrition while lowering calories. Yeah, the adrenaline will come up and bring cortisol after, and the cortisol is what makes you lose muscle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so instead she might try, adding some more calories, and would it serve her if her adrenaline's high to add carbohydrates?
Definitely, yeah. The carbohydrate at the right amount will spare the protein. So 80 grams of protein a day, for example, if you're getting the carbohydrate from orange juice, for example, comes with minerals. Potassium has a sparing effect on the protein besides the sugar. So fruit juice plus the adequate amount of protein will keep your metabolism up and tend to promote fat loss rather than protein loss.
Yeah, that's a very good tip, because anytime I've drank orange juice, I always feel warmer right after I drink it. And so I'm wondering if she would take her temperature prior to drinking it, and then after she might notice that she's getting less cold when she does that. Do you agree?
Yeah, you have to allow time for your the effect of the cold orange juice to wear off. Mm-hmm. If you drink warm orange juice, then you'll see the warming effect immediately.
Okay, very good. Okay, the second part of her question was she doesn't have a uterus because she had it removed, and her doctor told her that she doesn't need to she's taking progesterone, but her doctor said you don't need to take progesterone if you don't have a uterus, and she wanted to know if that was true.
Many doctors thought that was true 60 years ago, but I didn't know anyone still said that. Last time I saw that was, I think, 1970, roughly. But it's a kind of horrifying thing to think that a doctor still can believe that progesterone has use only to the uterus. Mm-hmm. Progesterone is one of the most basic molecules in the universe, and starting right from the ovum itself, it is involved in the structure of the ovum, mm-hmm. which organizes the genes, the cell division mechanism, everything from the beginning of the organism up, and as the organism matures, even before puberty, progesterone is in charge of brain development. If progesterone is low during gestation, the brain fails to develop. When it's given as a supplement, the brain becomes super able, bigger and more functional in animal experiments as well as humans. And in the mature adult brain, progesterone is a major steroid, 10 times higher in the brain, for example, than circulating in the blood. Mm-hmm. So you might say the uterus is a very minor field of operation for the progesterone molecule. It governs brain growth, brain function. If it's low, a woman will experience epileptic seizures when the brain progesterone falls too low. Mood, depression, a deficiency of progesterone affects every aspect of life.
Wow. Okay, so there's your answer, Christy. He says, yes, you can take your progesterone even without a uterus because there's so many other benefits to taking progesterone. So that's awesome. Okay, one more from Christy. She wanted to know, are sulfur supplements good or bad, such as in the form of MSM?
Oh, when people email me that question, I send them a couple of articles from about 40 years ago, I think it was. A woman in a California hospital was brought in, and she exploded in the operating room, and she died, and several of the staff were injured. And analyzing the chemistry of what happened, the best hypothesis seems to be that she was using MSM to treat a cancer, using very large amounts of it, and some fluke in the way it metabolized led to that toxic explosion. And that only happened once, but I think it's good for people to be aware of that chemical analysis that was done in California, just as an indicator of how little is known about the supplements that people so commonly use without knowing very much about the actual chemistry.
So she literally exploded, like her body exploded?
Yeah.
Wow.
Or the gases around, they had opened a big incision, and a surge of emissions. I think it was described as an explosion, but the fumes quickly knocked out several of the staff.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a supplement that we want to stay away from. As far as I know you mentioned that they took it for cancer, but why do people take MSM? I've never recommended it to my clients, but are there other reasons people take it, and is there something they could take instead?
If they're doing it as an anti-inflammatory, there are lots of anti-inflammatory things. The safest approach, I think, is to try to look at causes and see what the particular problem is. Low blood sugar leads to inflammation. Too much unsaturated vegetable oil in the diet amplifies inflammation. Too much phosphate in the diet relative to calcium is a very powerful promoter of inflammation. Things that overactivate the parathyroid gland will lead to inflammation, fibrosis, calcification, and thing that these supplements are recommended for. They almost always have a clear cause that can be approached. Supplementing calcium, for example, avoiding things that are overrich in phosphates, too much meat, too many beans, too many nuts, for example, those are all heavy in phosphates.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people I talk to about going off of nuts and seeds, and for the reason of PUFA, as well as oxalates, as well as inflammatory responses like what you're talking about, and how much better they feel after even like less than a week. They notice a difference being off of like nuts and nut butters and seeds and things like that. Okay, so Trudy asks, I would love to know Dr. Ray Peat's stance on colostrum powder and powdered milk.
Something that I just ran across a few months ago was that the dehydrating and powder-producing industry has, sometime in recent years, they have begun using nanoparticles to prevent clumping of their powders. And colostrum is a good idea. Powdered milk is just a wonder food for convenience. I've used hundreds of pounds of it myself, but recently running across this bit on the new technology, just so that the powder will flow easily. They're actually microscopically coating it with nanoparticles, and I haven't found any industry source which admits that they're using it, but on the internet you can look at nanoparticles and powdered milk products. You can find lots of articles about the use of it, people selling the technology to be used. And these nanoparticles, if they're in a particular size range, are carcinogenic and pro-inflammatory. And so for several months I haven't been recommending some of my favorite recipes, such as the powdered milk pancakes, flourless pancakes and biscuits and so on, because of the uncertainty of how these powders are being produced.
Yeah, there's so many things that start out great and then they process them a different way, and we as health advocates have to say okay, well, at one time I recommended those, but now I can't because they're changing the processing of it, so that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that happened with vitamin C in the mid-1950s. The research that made it famous was done in the 40s and early 50s, and I used it myself, and with 2 tablets, tiny tablets of 50 milligrams each, I ended a very intense poison oak allergy. So that I could work in the woods without a trace of poison oak sensitivity. Just after basically 100 milligrams of synthetic vitamin C, but the next time I took it, it had come down in price by about 90%, and the tablets were now 500 milligrams instead of 50 milligrams, and it caused cold symptoms and other allergy symptoms when I took it. And after my own experience, I started mentioning that to other people who had chronic sinus inflammation, runny nose, postnasal drip, cough, hemorrhoids, all kinds of mysterious ailments. I mentioned my experience with synthetic vitamin C, and a huge percentage of these people with chronic inflammatory problems solved it when they stopped taking their supplements.
Wow. Yeah, there's so much I've learned from you in particular about supplements and the things that are in them, kind of like the newsletter you had on silica and silicone dioxide, like how these supplements start out so great and then they use these products that really give us no reason to take them because we don't really want to be bringing sand particles into our digestive tract.
Nano sand.
Yeah. Okay, well, there you go. Okay, so this next question, this is kind of a loaded question, and hopefully you can explain to the listeners what exactly these big terms are. I'm familiar with them, but I want to hear from you. So it says, can you ask Dr. Peat about Pheochromocytoma, Paraganglioma's adrenal tumors, what we can do with this disease, and is there a connection to thyroid diseases and pheochromocytomas?
I suspect that there is. The people that I've known with the diagnosis, I urge them to check their thyroid function, and it happens that the people who had been diagnosed with that were actually hypothyroid, and in the absence of good thyroid function, the body looks for alternative ways to keep working, and one is to over-activate that particular kind of cell. It can go in different directions. Excess serotonin is one of the products. Excess adrenergic chemicals is another route. But I think of it as the body's inventing ways to get around an energy block or limitation. That happens with many of the regulatory endocrine systems. For example, with animals, many years ago they found that if you removed one ovary of an animal, the other ovary was very likely to develop cancer. And the mechanism was because the pituitary gland was producing enough activating gonadotropin for two hormones. It became more active to make one ovary do the work of two ovaries. It was overstimulating that ovary, driving it to the point that it became a tumor or a cancer. And in thyroid, there's good evidence that the same thing happens when you're deficient in some nutrient needed to make the thyroid hormone, or have something blocking the production of the hormone. Your pituitary becomes hyperactive, your TSH rises, and chronically overstimulates the thyroid gland, leading to thyroid cancer. And women, I think, I don't know what the proportion is, but they're more susceptible to developing thyroid cancer because of the estrogen blocking the secretion of the hormone and the pituitary having to work harder. I think it's the same chemical that can be used for a prolactin-secreting tumor, bromocriptine or cabergoline or lizaride, I think, are the chemicals used to treat a prolactinoma. Some of those can be used to treat the Cushing's syndrome, and I think if you keep the pituitary under control so that it isn't overstimulating your adrenals, you will reduce the risk of all of those. Once you get a tumor in the adrenal, it's too late to work on the level of the pituitary. But low thyroid function leads to increased prolactin for example, as well as the thyroid-stimulating hormone. And the excess of gonadotropins often follows the excess of thyroid-stimulating hormone and prolactin. And serotonin, which rises from either irritation in the digestive system or from a response to hypothyroidism. Serotonin happens to drive all of the pituitary hormones. So stress that leaves you with chronic serotonin excess can contribute to all of the tumor developments that are driven by the pituitary gland, which would include different types of adrenal tumors, thyroid tumor, ovarian tumors, all of the endocrine tumors.
Yeah. Okay, very good. The next question comes from John, and it says, what are your thoughts on the herbal form of Ephedra, also known as Hauang? Is this something that can be beneficial?
Yeah, I've used it from the time I was 4 years old, I think, and first had migraine-like headaches.
Oh, okay.
My grandmother made me Hauang tea, desert tea, it was called. And it's a powerful stimulant. It wakes you up. And so some people have used it for in an excessive chronic way, using it just for its stimulating purpose or for weight loss, for example. And in chronic excessive use, it contains things that are toxic to the liver. But if it's used just occasionally, medicinally, for example, to treat nausea or a headache.
Great. And with regard to weight loss, it kind of stimulates the beta receptors. Is that right? So it's harder, like for the stubborn fat areas. I remember that from my bodybuilding days. Everybody was on Ephedra because it would stimulate the beta receptors instead of the alpha receptors.
Yeah, but free fatty acids are the result, and free fatty acids are what make fat toxic. So it's better to eliminate the fat slowly and carefully rather than pushing it out with a stimulant like Hauang.
Yes, I agree. Okay, 2 more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up. But the next question is from Anne, and it says, what is your remedy, Dr. Peat, for cellulite? What would be your cure-all or a way to begin to heal a cellulite issue?
The immediate thing is to check your temperature, metabolic rate, look at your calorie and water consumption. You should be evaporating at least 2 liters of water every day that you can't account for. So if you drink, for example, 2 quarts of orange juice and 2 quarts of milk, you should produce a moderate amount, maybe a quart of urine per day. If most of your water intake appears in the form of urine, that means that you're not evaporating at a proper rate, and so your metabolic rate is low. Your temperature should be kept right around 98.6 during the daytime. The pulse rate well above the 60s, preferably in the 80s per minute. And to do that might require supplementing some extra calcium, making sure you're getting enough sodium in your diet. Having a vitamin D blood test is a good idea to make sure your level is up around 50 nanograms per milliliter. And vitamin D and thyroid work very closely together. The sodium and calcium work closely together to suppress the stress hormones and to activate the protective hormones such as DHEA and progesterone. And if you still have a tendency to what they call cellulite, for a quick remedy, supplementing progesterone and DHEA, rubbing it into those areas and taking 5 or 10 milligrams orally can activate the connective tissue metabolism to toughen up the tone of the tissue and help it get rid of the water.
I love that. That's, out of all of my time researching weight loss and fat loss and cellulite and things like that for clients, I've never heard somebody say rub that into your skin. So you're on the cutting edge. You're always coming up with things that no one else is saying, which is what I really enjoy about you. Okay, and that brings me to my last question. So I wanted to ask you a question that was kind of personal, but I was hoping that it would be kind of a fun question for you to answer. But what is your favorite pastime? Like, what do you do for fun?
I think painting is my favorite thing.
Yeah, I've seen some of your artwork online, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, whenever I can get someone to sit for me, I like portraits.
Well, that's great. So that's what I call my vitamin P, pleasure, passion, purpose, and we have to get vitamin P as well as all these other vitamins. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, definitely. It's really the key to the whole thing is to make it work pleasurably.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Peat, this has been so interesting and fun, and just really appreciate your time on all of these questions, and I hope the listeners who submitted questions do too, and we're definitely going to have to do this again because I think people are really going to benefit from all of the information, so I appreciate that. So we'll say bye for now. Any parting words you wanted to leave the listeners with?
Nope.
Okay. Well, make sure you check out Dr. Peat's newsletter and sign up for that. Go ahead and give them the way they can sign up for that, Dr. Peat.
Oh, okay. My website, raypeat.com, has a lot of my newsletters and articles, but at the email address for my newsletter is Ray Peat's newsletter at gmail.com.
Yes, and I highly encourage you guys listening to go get that. It's a way to support Dr. Peat for all of this amazing time that he gives to us and to show him your appreciation and learn a lot of great info. So I love that about you, and thank you once again, Dr. Peat. We'll do this again soon.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, bye for now.
What's up, YouTube followers? Just a quick promo code for you of my show sponsor, dropandfbomb.com. You can get healthy oil packets like coconut oil, MCT oil, and their little pork sticks, salt and pepper pork sticks, no hormones, no nitrates, no artificial anything. Just really great ingredients that are quick and easy and on the go. Use my code GETFIT, GETFIT, to save 10%. And go to dropinfbomb.com today to get your packets of on-the-go convenient foods, healthy convenient foods. And it's a healthy way to drop an F-bomb today.